So welcome everyone to NKR Panel 9, the Emerging Scholars Panel. We have some bright young minds with us today that will be presenting some recent research they have been working on. So first we have Zoe Stevens from National Cheng University, and she will be enlightening us a little bit on the name of North Korea and how what it means depending on which name you decide to use for North Korea, or the significance of it. And then we have Mr. Young-deok Shin, who is going to be giving us a presentation on alliances and institutionalization, or the logic behind the institutionalization of them.
So thank you very much for having me here, guys. It's a pleasure. I am Zoe, as we just heard, from National Cheng University. That's in Taiwan. And just to let you know a little intro about my background, I used to work in North Korea tourism. I still do, but as we all know, DPRK is very much closed at the moment, so I won't be going there anytime soon. But I've been working in and around the DPRK for the past 2 years, and now I am doing my PhD, my first year PhD student at NCKU, where I do a PhD in political economy. So today I am going to be talking about the naming practices of the DPRK, or North Korea, and with a belief that there are political implications behind it. Despite that, I would just want to say that in this presentation, there are no political implications on whether I choose to use the words North Korea or DPRK, and I will use them interchangeably. So just a heads up on that. This is the kind of abstract to it. So the study takes a look at naming practices, or like the terminology use when referring to the DPRK, i.e. North Korea, in Mandarin Chinese. So it looks and compares Taiwan and China to suggest the online media news outlets in these countries to suggest that there are political reasons for this choice in terminology. And then it goes to apply this to a bigger context with implications for cooperating with North Korea. So I actually first came across this topic whilst I was writing a different paper on media representations and media framings of North Korea in UK and in Chinese media. And I was looking for, and I noticed the differences between the UK using North Korea a lot instead of the DPRK, whereas China much prefers to use the DPRK, which we'll see shortly. And I was looking for some source on how sensitive the DPRK is to naming practices to use in my paper. When I realized I couldn't really find any, so it led me to kind of pursue this topic, because despite the fact that it's very well known within the community who work inside North Korea and with North Korea, I suppose, there wasn't any academic literature on the topic that I could find. So I wanted to explore it more. So the premise of this paper is that the DPRK cares how it's perceived. And these characters, these Chinese characters that are in here, I will explain them in a minute. So if it all looks a bit scary, don't worry. So the name is important to DPRK, as it implies, it has its hidden meaning of or implication of a unified Korea, because Choson was, which is how the DPRK refers to itself. That's basically, Choson is basically the translation for DPRK. Refers to like the last dynasty of Korean Peninsula rule before Japanese invasion. So during my explorations on Chinese and English language publications, I obviously found out that China used DPRK more, but I wanted to explore if this is simply a language issue, if it's simply a Mandarin Chinese language issue, or if there's more context to it. So I decided to choose two opposing political systems that use the same official language, that's Mandarin Chinese, and Taiwan and China, to explore how countries perceive the DPRK as North Korea or the DPRK as DPRK, and whether this depends on their relations with the DPRK, suggesting in the end that this terminology holds connotations such as legitimization to the state, and all under the hypothesis of countries with closer relations to the DPRK perceive and call it DPRK instead of North Korea. And now you see a lot of, I mean, let me just go back, a lot of Chinese characters here. I have a slide explaining all of this. And if anyone has any feedback at the end on this one, because I was debating using the Korean or Chinese names within this paper instead of DPRK versus North Korea. Obviously, I've chosen DPRK versus North Korea, but let me know if it's confusing in any way. But I will try and explain it as simple as possible. I'm going to be try and go like not into detail so much as well, and sorry, this slide as well is just in terms of North Korea or the DPRK. So North Korea sees itself as Korea is one. So there's a phrase that they say all the time, which is Choson and Hanada, which is what those Korean characters say there. They don't see the Korean peninsula as a divided peninsula. If you ever go to North Korea, you'll see that there are maps and they are all full maps of the Korean peninsula. There is no dividing line in between. And if you hadn't realized it already, North Korea is a very, very sensitive nation. And it has made comments in the past about significant consequences if it is named incorrectly. For example, this quote here that was taken from KCNA, that's basically threatens the Japanese government for not correctly calling it by its correct name, DPRK. Yeah. Oh, won't let me move on. Okay, so a little bit of background on China and Taiwan as well, because the whole premise of this is, the relations with the DPRK. Again, I'll try not go into much detail because it's pretty clear the big differences, but Taiwan has very little political interest in being an ally of the DPRK. Indeed, it hasn't had any economic relations, I think, since 2018. Yep. When Taiwan produced its own rules. Originally, actually, it didn't have the UN sanctions, not being a member of the UN, not being a member state of the UN. So it wasn't stopped by UN sanctions from working with North Korea. So there was actually quite a lot of economic stuff going on with Taiwan. But since 2018, the country's, like Taiwan's own rules reflect the UN's rules. So there is no economic ties, trade with DPRK since then. China, on the other hand, geographically and politically close, always referred to as one of its closest allies. And it goes up to the fact that it still engages in trade in North Korea, and Chinese staff in Pyongyang, like embassy staff, were some of the last to leave due to COVID-19, things like that. So this is where it looks very scary and very complicated. And I do have to introduce this stuff a little bit because it gives a lot of context to the paper. The main things that you kind of need to know are in the top right-hand corner that you can see here. So as I said before, North Korea refers to itself as Choson, or I can't remember how to say Choson Minjujuwi Inmin Gonghwa-guk, and that is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So I put both the Chinese and the Korean here because I want to demonstrate that the Chinese literally translates directly from Korean. And this is important because it shows how North Korea exactly want to be portrayed. And I find it interesting that, it can translate directly, and it does, especially in the mainland Chinese use, whereas in Taiwan, they have created like their own phrases. So the main things that you need to know here are that Choson means DPRK, and then the longer version of it, I'm not going to read that again. Choson then translates to Chaoxian in Mandarin Chinese, so it's the same. It then and then obviously you have the longer version of it, which is Chaoxian Minjujuwi Renmin Gongheguo. Again, just the longer version of it. That is how mainland China uses the term DPRK or North Korea a lot. Taiwan, on the other hand, uses various terms. So as I'll present in my results shortly, you have also other terms such as Bei Chaoxian. So Bei Chaoxian is Bei meaning north. So it literally means Chaoxian meaning the Korean peninsula and north of it. Okay. You then have Beihan. Now, Beihan is important because Han is anything that holds connotations to South Korea. Okay, Han is always South Korea and it's pronounced exactly the same in both Mandarin Chinese and Korean. South Korea also calls itself Hanguk. Okay. So then you have Beihan, which is very hard to translate into English because it pretty much means north of South Korea, because Han almost indefinitely refers to the south of Korea. But then you have Bei on it. So, you know, you can see why North Korea wouldn't like that naming practice. And also that is how South Korea refers to North Korea as well, Bukhan. Literally, again, directly translated. You then have Nan Chaoxian, which is not used so much, but Nan Chaoxian, Nan meaning south. So again, you've got Bei and Nan Chaoxian, but you're using Chaoxian, which has the DPRK connotations. I hope you're all keeping up so far. They are basically the main things that you need to know from there. Han has connotations with South Korea. Chaoxian always has connotations with North Korea, apart from it when it is referring to the Korean peninsula. Chaoxian Dao is also used. That literally means Korean peninsula. So for the sake of this presentation, Chaoxian always refers to North Korea or North Korean connotations. Han always refers to South. Okay, I hope you're not too lost now. So this is basically how I conducted the research. I took all of these keywords, all of any reference that I could find in my own experience. I speak Mandarin Chinese, by the way, and also a little bit of Korean. But in my own experience of reading and speaking in Chinese, both in mainland China and Taiwan, I collected words that I have heard refer to North Korea. And then I typed them into Google using a search way that basically let me use a 5-month period and just look for those exact keywords that appeared in on a specific website. So I used 3 online news media outlets for each place as well. So mainland China 3 and Taiwan 3. And then I also showed, you can see the number of outlets that I looked at here. And I put them into percentages here. So basically, I looked at the first table that you can see here is the naming references, how many times I found in one article. So in one article, this is the main reference of the DPRK that I found. The first 3 ones that you can see, Xinhua People's Daily and China News, they are all mainland Chinese news outlets. And then the second 3 that you can see, United Daily News, China Times, and Liberty Times, are all Taiwanese outlets. So from the first table, you can see that the primary reference to North Korea in Chinese media news outlets, mainland China, is 100% either the DPRK or the full name, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In fact, in People's Daily and in China News, there was a percentage that mainly used the reference Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is really quite a mouthful and a lot to write in a news article. Whereas Taiwan is a lot more varied in its primary naming. You have Beihan, which is North Korea, a lot more. You also have Bei Chaoxian and the north of Korea, again, it's a little bit complicated, and then DPRK sometimes as well. In the secondary reference, so the reference that appeared the second most amount of times, in mainland Chinese outlets, you had very little variation. If they used DPRK most of the time, then the second reference was always going to be Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Or if they used Democratic People's Republic of Korea most of the time, the second reference was going to be DPRK. There was no reference to Beihan, North Korea, or Bei Chaoxian, North Korea with a small n because it refers to geographical location technically. Whereas again, in the secondary references, in Taiwanese newspapers, it was a lot more varied, using some DPRK, but mainly North Korea as well. So kind of why does this all matter? By proving that, I mean, in these findings, I believe that Taiwanese, the Taiwanese naming practices and the common naming practices of the DPRK or of North Korea are because it has no motivation to be politically allied with China, and whereas with North Korea, whereas China knows, China wants to have the DPRK almost as a political ally, and also it knows because it is a country that itself, in fact, both of them, China and Taiwan, both understand the importance of naming practices, because Taiwan itself is a country fighting for however you want to say it, is a place fighting for legitimacy on the global stage. So it understands naming practices. China also understands the importance of naming practices. And by demonstrating that it has these political implications, I think that on a wider scale, we can start to look at, if anyone was to engage or cooperate with North Korea, I think that correctly naming it, or correctly, using these naming practices shows respect, and shows that you are seeing it as a legitimate partner, which is what China is demonstrating by doing. And that's basically it. So I hope you managed to kind of keep up with the awkward terminology that I had in there. And this clipping at the end is a clipping from an Australian newspaper, which I found quite interesting at the Olympic football event, Nice Korea versus Naughty Korea. Anyway, thank you very much. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Zoe. I appreciate your keeping it short and sweet.
Yeah.
That was very, very informative. All right, so Mr. Shin, would you like to go next?
Well, hello everybody. My name is Young-deok Shin. I'm currently a master's student at Young University's Graduate School for Political Science. It's a privilege for me to be able to present here. My paper is very theoretical and a lot of quantitative analysis, so it has a lot of different parts, so I'll try to be as concise as possible. So the title of my paper is How do Alliances Deal with Belligerent Allies, Reputation, Intra-Alliance Deterrence, and Alliance Institutional Design. As evident from my title, my topic is on Alliance Institutional Design, and my research question is what accounts for the institutional diversity in alliance treaties, such as the different types of pacts, defense pacts, neutrality pacts, as well as the different types of provisions like economic aid or non-military cooperation, etc. So in other words, what factors are behind the decisions that states make for certain alliance institutional arrangements? Now, the institutional design of alliances is arguably an overlooked area within the alliance politics literature. While there have been some early substantial works on institutional compositions and patterns within alliances, most of this has been quite broad or limited in generalizability. And given its sheer diversity, institutional design remains a relatively lucrative area for research in an otherwise quite inundated field of alliance politics, perhaps the most inundated. Furthermore, the quantitative database compiled by Leeds and her colleagues have made it possible to conduct more in-depth and large-scale research within alliance institutional design. So going back to my main research question, what potential factors are behind state decisions for certain alliance designs? Well, my argument is that the belligerent reputation of member states, or the potential for belligerence, causes alliances to use institutional means to counter it. So this would make my belligerent reputation as my independent variable, my main independent variable, and alliance institutional design as my dependent variable. Right, so what do I mean by belligerent reputation? Well, it's the form of opportunistic behavior found in Glenn Snyder's Alliance Security Dilemma, in which once an alliance is already formed, states have to manage between the twin fears of abandonment caused by commitment violations, and entrapment caused by unilateral belligerence, which pulls in allies into unwanted conflict, thereby endangering the overall security of alliance. This can be shown in the figure up there. As you can see, there's the twin sources of unreliability. And so I present, I look at belligerence as a form of alliance unreliability, which has been relatively overlooked in comparison to the unreliability in the form of commitment violation. And it's been studied mostly conceptually or through specific case studies that are quite hard to generalize. Now, given its importance and need for further research, I present belligerent unreliability in the form of state reputation based on previous studies, namely Chris Kinsey's work. This means looking at a state's belligerent interaction record or war instigation or diplomatic conflict instigation record with other states, as well as its relevance to the alliance seeker. This can be seen in the figure right there. So there's the belligerent history with other states, and then the second step is looking at its relevance. And so this is the logic of belligerent reputation, and I'm looking at how this would impact the alliance design, or specifically treaty obligations, military institutionalization levels, and provisions. Right. So in terms of analytical contribution, why is this important? Well, I contribute to three main areas. Like I said, alliance institutional design is a relatively overlooked area, and existing studies typically focus on alliance design as a independent variable, not a dependent variable. Studies on international institutions in general have focused on environmental and economic organizations, but rarely in security organizations. Secondly, for state reputation, combining state reputation with interstate belligerence exclusively has been rarely done, and this provides implications for how state reputation affects alliance management and not just alliance formation. And in terms of just alliance politics implications, the belligerent concern is an overlooked form of alliance unreliability, and I also look at deterrence from an intra-alliance perspective. Right. Now, as for my theoretical framework, I use the rational design of institutions literature, which is representative of the rational functionalist school of studying international organizations. This is basically the idea that international organizations are a product of collective action problems and its solutions. The main idea is that rational states will use international institutions as a means to achieve mutually beneficial cooperation. And so this rationale treats alliances as international institutions, which states use to solve difficult collective action problems, such as unreliability from belligerent opportunity. I look at the extent to which this theory holds true for security institutions, as most of the previous applications have been on environmental or economic organizations. Now, regarding my hypothesis, according to this literature, unreliability can be mitigated by three main measures: specifying the regulations, centralizing or institutionalizing the key tasks, and increasing the scope of cooperation through issue linkage areas. So using these principles, I sort of create what I call the intra-alliance deterrence measures. That is, when allying with states that have belligerent reputation, the alliance will likely to have a high chance of specifying the conditions of military obligation, such as placing conditions for defense commitments, avoiding offensive or non-aggression obligations. So this variable is composed of offensive, defensive, non-aggression, and consultative obligations. For the second one, secondly, the alliance will also most likely will increase in military institutionalization, such as integrated military command, military coordination, stipulations on territorial acquisition. And thirdly, the alliance will also increase the scope of cooperation through creating issue linkages in non-military cooperation, mainly in trade. So these three measures are what I call the intra-alliance deterrence enhancing measures. And my main argument is that the alliances will implement these measures when there is a state that has a high belligerent reputation. Right. So how do I operationalize this? So basically, I'm using a statistical approach because of the large-scale research that I'm doing. I'm not looking at specific one or two countries, but one or two alliances, but it's like an n-scale approach. I will just go over the main independent and dependent variables because of time constraints. So for the main belligerent reputation, how do I operationalize this? I look at, first of all, the war and diplomatic conflict initiating track record, which you can find in the COW data set, and especially focusing on whether it has revisionist intention. And then secondly, just because the state has a belligerent record, it doesn't necessarily mean the state is belligerent. It has to be relevant to the alliance partner. So checking for the relevancy of belligerence, I look at how recent the instigations occurred. I look at whether it happened within the relevant political environment, so within your region. And then I also focus on, look at the victim states and whether they had similar foreign policy with the alliance partner. And finally, treaty signing conditions, so whether states had ulterior motives or whether they were forced. So looking at these variety of factors, I assess the relevancy of the belligerence. And for my dependent variable, alliance institutionalization, I use the HEOP dataset, which is the most comprehensive dataset on alliance obligation, alliance treaties. So first of all, I look at the conditionality of obligation, focusing on the defense, offense, non-aggression, and consultative pacts. And if there is a condition, or if there is a condition, it is coded as 1 or 0 if there isn't. Secondly, for military institutionalization, I look at the level of the institutionalization, and the levels range from 3 being the most institutionalized, 2 in the middle, and 1 being the least institutionalized. And finally, for scope, if there are measures for non-military cooperation issue linkage measures, this is coded as either 1 or 0. Now, I'm using dyadic level data set spanning from 1815 to 2018. And I'm using logit regression or ordered logit regression. So I'll just skip this part because for the results, for those of you who are not familiar with statistical analysis, basically what matters is just look at the stars. If the variable has stars within its for its coefficients, then it means it is statistically significant and basically theoretically significant. And so if you look at my 3 models, so first of all, for the conditionality of obligations, you can see that it's quite significant. And it proves that if an alliance has a state with a belligerent reputation, indeed the alliance implements conditions for its obligations, so it increases the preciseness of its treaty language. For the second hypothesis for military institutionalization, you can see that it has 3 stars, so it's very significant, the most significant out of the results. And this alliances do indeed increase the level of institutionalization when there's a potentially belligerent state. And then, surprisingly for the third one, the measure that provides incentives for more cooperation, this has if you look at the coefficient, it has a negative in the front, which means it's a negative correlation. So it is meaningful, but the negative correlation basically signifies that this does not, it signifies an opposite effect. So it basically, these type of incentive measures happen when both states are peaceful, and it certainly does not happen when there is a potentially belligerent state within the alliance. So these are the results for my 3 main hypotheses. Now, because of time constraints, I will not go into the results for the individual control measures, control variables. Go to the next. Okay. So for just for further insight, I ran the regression models for individual obligations. So the defense, offense, non-aggression, consultation pacts, these obligations make up the conditionality of obligation variable. And so you can see that when there is a belligerent reputation, when there's a state with belligerent reputation, alliances would provide defense obligations, but it would, because defense basically means providing military assistance when an ally is under attack, but it does not provide for offense obligations because that would be providing military assistance regardless of being attacked. And then, as I predicted, non-aggression pacts were also not provided. Yeah. So so this just provides a further insight, and then also for I looked at the individual provisions within military institutionalization. So you can see that they were all significant. This was by far my strongest variable. And indeed, mediation mechanisms, integrated command, military coordination, joint organization, and these measures were implemented when there was alliance partner with a belligerent reputation. Now, finally, because military institutionalization was a very large variable that consisted of a lot of different provisions, I suspected that the results would be different depending on whether the alliance was symmetric or asymmetric. So I thought that power capabilities would be an intervening factor for this, and I predicted that within symmetric alliances, because partners have similar capabilities, this would result in a unified command control institutionalization. And then for asymmetric alliances, if a smaller ally is belligerent, then the more powerful ally would totally just subordinate the military command to its favor. Whereas if the powerful ally is belligerent, then the smaller ally, all it can do is just implement military coordination measures. So this basically this result reflects my predictions. As you can see, they're both significant for military institutionalization, but for symmetric alliances, you can see that the integrated military command, the unified command structure is significant, whereas for the asymmetric alliances, the subordination of military forces is more significant, and as well as military coordination. Right. That's quite a mouthful, but those are my results. And quickly for my main conclusion. So states do indeed react in response to alliance partners with belligerent reputation through institutional measures, albeit slightly mixed results. Obligation conditionality and military institutionalization were the two main methods of intra-alliance deterrence, while issue linkage was only present with non-belligerent allies, therefore not applicable. And one possible reason for this that I thought of is because when we talk about belligerent states, when they try to unilaterally acquire different territories, it's mostly a sovereignty issue for them, and no manner of non-military cooperation will prevent them from achieving issues of sovereignty. I could go into this logic in more detail in the discussions part of the presentation, and for thirdly, for military institutionalization, the effect of belligerent reputation on symmetric and asymmetric alliances is different due to varying reliability concerns. Obviously, symmetric alliances contain a more equitable, unified military command, while asymmetric alliances are more likely to have subordinated military command. So symmetric alliances in general have more military institutionalization, equitable military institutionalization, whereas within asymmetric alliances, there is this two different patterns. When the more powerful ally is concerned, then it tends to totally dominate the military institutionalization. Whereas if a small ally is concerned with its bigger ally, then all it can do is realistically just instituting military coordination measures. So in terms of areas for improvement, I know this study is quite it's a lot of statistics, and it could be sort of reinforced with case studies, which I have not done yet, and then it could be more precisely measured through a continuous variable measurement of belligerent reputation. And finally, there are a lot of variations that I could explore within the interlines deterrence. Right. Thank you.
So I guess to get the discussion started, I will just go through my thoughts on the presentation. So first of all, Ms. Stevens, I can't remember whether I've discussed this with you before in previous discussions, but this idea of the importance of what you call the DPRK, honestly, as the managing editor of North Korean Review, I never had given it that much thought. It wasn't until I have a friend who sometime around 2016 or 2017, he became a Bitcoin millionaire. And he literally decided to spend the rest of his life just doing whatever he wanted to. So he's taken an expedition to the Arctic. He's gone to New Zealand and driven F1 cars. And one of the things he decided to do was to take the expensive personal tour of North Korea, not the group tour. So he was assigned two tour guides in North Korea. And when he came back from North Korea, I met up with him and we had dinner, and he was showing me all his pictures, and he kept saying DPRK, 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 DPRK. And when I referred to it, when I mentioned something about North Korea, he said, "Don't call it North Korea." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "They don't like it." I said, "Okay." And he said, "It's North Korea is a relativistic term for North Korea, which means it only exists in juxtaposition to South Korea." And I had never actually thought about it that way, but you know, the old rhetorical question, "What's in a name?" kind of rings true. This idea that we live in a world now where people care about their pronouns, or if they happen to do some sort of gender reassignment surgery, they don't like to have their previous name used. So what you call someone is a genuinely sensitive topic. And I think that it shouldn't be surprising that authoritarian regime like North Korea doesn't like to be called by other than its preferred name. So it's kind of intuitive in that respect, what you're arguing, but the way that you go about examining it is quite interesting from the perspective of, you know, kind of the two sides of the Chinese coin in Taiwan and China. So, and actually, this is another story I tell people. The idea of names also have a lot of power and like importance in terms of how people view you. And in South Korea, this institute, it changes names depending on who the president is. When Park Geun-hye was president, this was Yeondae Tonil Yongguwon, because North Korea can only really exist, according to the conservatives, as an object to absorb into South Korea. That's why she had her Tongil Daebaknon and, you know, the reunification bonanza speech that she gave. And a lot of her rhetoric in her speeches tended to focus on North Korea as this poor cousin that South Korea was going to ride in and save. And when you have a more left-leaning president in the Blue House, or whatever it is in Yongsan now, then they tend to view North Korea as a potential partner to try and, you know, cooperate with, and it becomes Yonsei Institute for North Korean Studies again. And if you don't believe me, the wooden sign outside this door, literally, they have both names on either side, so that when they change the president, they can just flip it. So this idea of the importance of a name it's a real thing. So again, I enjoyed the way that you get into it and try and do some sort of textual analysis of it. So I do have a few comments and questions though. So as you said in your introduction, you have extensive experience traveling in North Korea. So I'm sure you've met plenty of North Koreans. Have you ever had a conversation with a North Korean about this and heard their perspective on it? Because I'm sure that they've had to correct tourists who came and called it North Korea. And so, you know, it would be an anecdotal response, but I'm you know, very few people get to hear those anecdotal stories. So I would be curious about that. And as I just said, referring to how the name of this institute changes, the South Korean views on North Korea vary greatly depending on the administration in power. I know that you were focusing on Taiwan and China, but I think it would be really interesting if you were to look at the South Korean media and perhaps how it was referred to by South Korean media. And I mean, when I came up with this question, it is something that would be interesting to me. I have a feeling though that the question would answer itself because the South Korean media tends to be either conservative or left-leaning, and it probably is constant in the way it would be referred to. But I really think it would be interesting to see if maybe through presidential speeches or something, rather than the South Korean media, there might be a way to try and unpack how they refer to it or maybe they're just really consistent. I don't know. But I think it might be an interesting angle as well. And then as far as the overall idea of your paper, like I said, I find it really interesting, but I think if you were to talk to a lot of people like you looked at countries that have an existing relationship with North Korea beyond simply seeing them on the news when they launch a rocket. So, but I think there's a lot of countries that are so far away from North Korea that their assumption is North Korea is North Korea, and that's just, they're not calling it out of some sense of disrespect or desire to put North Korea down or shame them. They just don't know any better. It's just like, you know, ignorance, like first world ignorance. They're busy with their first world problems and they're not really concerned with what to call North Korea. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how much of this is just simple ignorance on the part of Western countries. And there's the other aspect that countries that are closer to North Korea geographically would have more interaction with them. So of course they should call them by the proper name. But that's what makes your research interesting. Like, I think if you were to unpack, you have to somehow strip out the response that some people would have that, oh, this is just ignorance on the part of some countries. But definitely Taiwan knows how the DPRK would like to be called and still doesn't. So that's a very pointed calling them by a name that they probably know that North Korea doesn't like. Then so I was thinking you need to look for a way to deal with these two kind of easy explanations for calling it North Korea as opposed to the DPRK. And then last but not least, you mentioned that legitimacy in your introduction slide, it has that quote from Gunther. And it talks about, you know, the power of naming practices, but I'm curious what the literature says about like the naming of countries. Like, do they go into like specifics? Like this is, like when you're dealing with North Korea, a lot of North Korea watchers say you have to read between the lines of their newspapers to try and, you know, read the tea leaves to understand what they mean. But you had that quote where they're very explicitly addressing Japan and saying, we don't like what you called us. So in terms of the literature on the power of naming, does it give us any insight into or a better understanding of North Korean behavior in this way? Or I'm just, because we only have that one passing quote, I'm just a little bit curious about the theoretical underpinnings of what you're talking about. And then last but not least, which one is nice Korea? I'm sure we all know the answer to that. I was just trying to. All right, and then Mr. Shin. So again, like I said, the level of effort that you put into this and the amount of work there is pretty extensive. I'm going to tease him a little bit. I have never received such a long paper for a conference before. But I obviously you're enthusiastic about the topic. No one writes that much if they're not. So this idea of alliance unreliability and abandonment concerns, I think that is always like the core of when you're entering an alliance, can you trust your alliance partner? And how do you build some sort of measures into the alliance that prevent abandonment or make abandonment or defection more difficult? So you go through all of your hypotheses deal with this idea of people or states that look at a potential alliance partner from among belligerent states. And I'm curious because the idea of an alliance is that you have their back and they have your back. But if you know that they're going to get in a lot of fights, like, from a very personal logic, I don't think you want to necessarily go out with your friend who picks a fight every time you go out. So I'm curious. I obviously the statistical analysis bears fruit and tells you what you expected it to, but I'm curious about the motivation of entering into an alliance with a belligerent state. It seems like a precarious thing, and of course all of the military institutionalization and coming up with specific clauses in the alliance agreement that if this happens, it triggers this clause, and then we go to war on your behalf. And then non-military cooperation also makes it harder to, uncouple from your alliance or decouple from your alliance partner. So those all make sense to me. But I'm a little curious about either why you would want to enter into an alliance with someone who could drag you into a fight against your will. And this is something that I write these regular reports on the security situation on the Korean Peninsula. And whenever especially following the Pelosi visit to Taiwan and all of the Chinese drills, that was something I put in my reports. I said, what if there is a war? What happens with Korea? Do they get drug into that war because they're in an alliance with the US? And no Korean wants that. So that is but at the same time, whenever Korean politicians talk about the alliance, they talk about a strong and enduring US-ROK alliance, and want to maintain these strong alliance ties. But at the same time, the US gets in a lot of fights. So to me, that's a little bit scary. I'm just curious about this idea of belligerent states, and I know that your analysis is statistical, but my belief is that statistical analysis is always trying to underpin, certain assertions and hypotheses in real world applicable ideas. So you're mentioning that you haven't done case studies yet, but again, I brought up the US-ROK one because it's probably the most familiar and easiest for you to apply what you've done here too. So I'm curious what insights you think your research offers to the analysis or understanding of the US-ROK alliance. And I'm also curious, like you're talking about how the alliance has survived, but going back to the idea of joining in an alliance with a belligerent state. Do you have any thoughts on the impetus or like beginnings of an alliance? Because your analysis talked about, are they both democracies? Is there a shared threat perception, etc.? And a lot of people who look at Northeast Asia always say, oh, we really wish South Korea and Japan would cooperate more because they have a lot in common and they have a common threat, but they only tend to cooperate through their ties to the US in the hub and spoke type system. So you were saying that obviously issues of sovereignty are difficult to overcome and they can be a hurdle, but I'm also curious about your thoughts on what your research might say about if President Yoon was to go as far as he possibly could with Japan and suddenly say we're going to have an alliance. I don't think it would be politically popular, but he's not popular anyway. So if they were to join in an alliance, do you think that your research shows that that would be successful, or would there be issues? And then my last question, I promise, is what about, or no, the perspective of a belligerent. So I don't think any state, anyone who lives, if your country was called a belligerent, that's, nobody wants to be viewed that way. So I'm curious about the actual definition of a belligerent and what is the, from whose perspective?
My name is Chloe. I'm a PhD student at EWA GSIS. I think both topics were really fascinating and I learned a lot from their presentations, and they obviously fill some gaps in the literature. So I think they're going to make really important contributions to the research. So first of all, for Zoe, I think this is a really fascinating area. I did want to comment because you asked for feedback about the presentation of the terms. I really can't think of another way to do it except to Romanize the terms if it's for an English speaking audience, unless you can assume that the readers are going to be familiar with both Korean and Chinese script, because I think it probably will be clear from context, but it might get a bit confusing about whether, when you say North Korea, whether Korea is Hangbo, Chaoxian, and Hanguk, Chosun in different kind of parts of the paper. But one question I had as well about is whether, as a kind of part 2 to your research, you might consider looking at the terms that people use. As my understanding from your presentation is that you focused on media, and from the mainland China, I'm guessing that the media sources were state affiliated, which might suggest that they'd be more likely to use the kind of officially accepted term. It would be much harder, I'm sure, to look at what people used kind of in everyday life, but maybe easier in Taiwan than mainland China, I'm not sure. But I wondered if that could be quite an interesting kind of part 2 to the research, if you had the opportunity to do that, and whether you had any indication already of what people might use kind of just in everyday speech, whether they would use the same word, the same terms that are used in the media. I was also just curious what you said about the maps in North Korea showing the whole peninsula, and I wondered what term they use for South Korea on the map, if any at all, because I think that's a big question in South Korea as well. What term is used on maps for North Korea? Sometimes they're just completely blank and they just don't have any names at all. And for the second presentation, again, really interesting subject. It's not something that I know a lot about, so I might be asking a very obvious question here. But in terms of the belligerent states that you were talking about, are these states that are kind of always already perceived as belligerent, as it's like it's actually a part of their kind of natural state, or kind of or kind of their relational terms? Or are there cases where a state could be part of an alliance and then suddenly the perception of that state changes? So suddenly they do something which alters the perception and they're suddenly seen as belligerent. So again, apologies if it's an obvious question. It's not something that I've studied, but but I think your results were really interesting. So thank you both very much.
Yeah,
All right.
I'll try and answer all those questions in good timing so that we both get a chance to answer them all. So first of all, thank you for the great questions and the great feedback to everyone who commented. It's very useful. Firstly, I'd really love to meet your friend who you know, got the millions of Bitcoin. Sounds like a kind of great guy. For tourism in North Korea and for kind of anecdotal stuff, in terms of North Korea versus the DPRK, I, in all honesty, can't remember the last time I asked a North Korean about this, because if I ever asked it, it would have been like a few years ago when I first started going there. But I want to reiterate kind of what Lonnie said. The going to North Korea is probably one of the first times that a lot of people hear the name DPRK, and they get so used to saying it because it is the only way that you can refer to North Korea when you are in North Korea. And I hear it in my own speech as well. I haven't been there in years now, since COVID. So I say North Korea more, but at that time when I was working there and going in all the time, in and out all the time, I would use DPRK way more, whether it be with my friends, my family, or whatever, outside of the country. But there is, if you ask a North Korean what it means to them, you know, their answer is just, it's respect and it's legitimacy. There is no South Korea, there is no North Korea. There is only Korea, and that is so before, you know, enemy number one, Japanese colonizers come in, and that is before enemy number two, the US, two guys sit down and decide, hey, we're going to draw a line here. And so for North Korea, the only legitimate Korea is the Korean Peninsula, is Choson. And so to call it North Korea is deeply offensive to them, because that is, on a personal note, that's acknowledging this illegal split of their sovereignty, how they see it. You know, there is no legitimate splitting of the Korean Peninsula as they see it in North and South Korea. And also on a more personal note, they're very stuck in the past. They're not over this whole separation thing. They're not over the Korean War. They're not over all of that. So, and the thing that they want the most is reunification. So calling it North Korea is acknowledging the split and also denying them of this unification with South Korea, which is what they really crave. And just to answer Chloe's question, because it kind of has some relevance, in terms of what term they use for South Korea, from memory, they use, I think bun is part in Korean, right? My Korean's gone so rusty right now. So they call it like Nambun, like the south part, referring to the geographical location if they need to. But otherwise, if they want to refer to south of Korea, like when we as tour guides tell people how to refer to South Korea, or if they want to explicitly refer to North Korea, it's always the geographical location. So the south of Korea or the north of Korea, that is also how they refer to it themselves. There is no North and South Korea, two separate things. I really liked your comment on using South Korean and using the Korean language. I think the reason that I didn't is mainly because my Chinese is better. So having to do some keyword searches through, especially if I was going to look at political speeches or something, which is, I think, is a great idea, because I think my research is quite limited. Actually, by choosing media outlets, it kind of takes away a little bit of the political aspect to it, because it is online media. I chose online media because of its proliferation and its ease of access, but it would be a deeper, I think it would have more meaning if I chose like some kind of like official websites, maybe political websites or speeches. So I really liked your idea of using Korean, so I might try and go into that. I just want to say as well, my data didn't go in my presentation. I didn't go into the political leanings of the two Taiwanese news outlets as well, but I just wanted to say that the data did show that the more pro-Taiwanese outlets, there's one of them, they use the DPRK way less and use North Korea way more, and pro-China outlets used DPRK way more. So it kind of was reflected in the political leaning of those newspapers too. Quickly as well, the literature review, again, I didn't go into that too much because of timing, but there's a lot of literature on the politics of naming and the legitimacy that it implies as well. I mean, look at, I can't remember the name of Kazakhstan as capital city changed twice recently, I think maybe even 3 times, according to the new president, and then they decided to change it back. Look at Ireland, there's still political and religious ramifications for how you call certain place names in Ireland even today. There's a lot of literature saying that place names are an element of culture and identity. Identity, of course, has to be built. The DPRK is one of those countries that is really trying to build its identity and legitimize itself. They're like symbolic not only for the country but also for the people in power as well. So by that, it goes on to like giving Kim Jong-un or the leader legitimacy, just providing more kind of providing more of an identity to the country. But I went into a whole literature review. I'm not going to go into that right now, but there's a lot of literature on that. I'm going to pass the floor over to over now because I think we don't have much time. But if anyone has any more questions, then you can let me know.
I received a lot of questions, which are quite predicted results because my presentation probably didn't do a good enough job of tidying up different details. So for the most important question, so the justification for allying with a belligerent state in the first place. Well, so I did mention this in the paper, but just due to time constraints, I didn't mention the presentation. But mainly it's because of strategic necessity, whether that's because of having a common enemy. For example, if you look at the early 1900s, Britain and France, they sort of had this entente in which there's strategic competition in Africa regarding their colonial possessions. Despite that, they made a rapprochement because they feared they had a common enemy of Germany. So there's this strategic necessity resulting stemming from a common enemy, and also there's this issue that unlike the business world where you have a variety of different partners you could partner up with, in the world of international politics, there's only a number of allies that you could form alliances with. So there's also that, and sometimes, and also another really important aspect is, in international politics, you really never have a complete set of information when it comes to assessing the motivations or the state affairs of different states. So you never have like a complete set of information. There's also, you always operate on a incomplete set of information. So there could be miscalculation when it comes to forming alliances. You could suspect that this supposedly belligerent ally, you can sort of calculate that maybe I could control this risk of belligerence, and it turns out that you can't control it, or it could turn out that you could control the belligerence. So it's really based on the strategic necessity and the lack of information. For the second question, the implications for U.S. ROK alliance. So actually Victor Cha conducts a pretty interesting case study on this point, where in Eisenhower and the Lee-Syngman administrations, actually Lee-Syngman administration during the Korean War was perceived by the U.S. as being very belligerent because he had the sort of rogue potential to go against the U.S. initiative to conduct an armistice, but he wanted to reunify the peninsula. So that's why the U.S. sort of institutionally try to placate Lee and just prevent him from doing that. So in that way, you can see the entrapment, belligerent dynamic over there. But I think recently, I think it was more of an abandonment issue rather than an entrapment issue for the US-RK alliance, because South Korea is always worried about whether the US would abandon the alliance. And most recently, with the China-US competition, I think it's quite relevant because it is getting more of an entrapment issue in which not just for Korea, but all the other US alliances where America is tightened tensions with China, and potential escalation could lead to US allies having to participate in the conflict. So I think in that regard, it has huge implications. Yeah, for the current geopolitical climate. Right. As for the thoughts on the beginnings of alliance, I think it was mainly, this study is mainly focused on the alliance management issue, because if you look at the alliance security dilemma, it's divided into two parts. First of all, it's whether to ally or not. If you ally with a state, you get stronger security, but at the same time, you're making enemies with other states. So that is one dilemma. And then the second stage of the dilemma is that your allies could abandon you, or so you have to give assurances. But if you give too much assurances, you could get entrapped in their belligerent opportunism. So I think my paper focuses on the sort of like the alliance management phase, like the dilemmas that arise from that, and perhaps more applicable to asymmetric alliances in that regard. So, and for the question of how do you measure belligerence, that's actually a very good question. So for my presentation, for my statistical analysis, so theoretically, I looked at measuring belligerence with regards to parts. So first of all, you look at, when you look at a state, you look at how much war instigation or diplomatic conflict instigation that it instigated in the past, perhaps like a 10-15-year period. And then secondly, just because it did commit belligerent, just because it did commit war or diplomatic belligerence, it's not necessarily a aggressive state to you if it happens somewhere way over the world, or whether if it happened because of justified reasons. So you really have to look at whether it had revisionist intentions in order to just to see its like a basic sort of taste of its belligerence. And then secondly, so you have to look at the relevancy of that belligerence. And I did mention like the different factors for measuring belligerence, whether it happened in your area, so that would impact your geopolitical climate, and also how recent it happened. Like if your allying partner, like for example, like Russia or Azerbaijan, or Russia or Armenia, like Armenia and Azerbaijan are always in conflict with each other, and with regards to Russia, it could feel like it could get embroiled in their conflict. So if it happened recently, I think the effect of belligerence would increase. And also like, yeah, so the region of the belligerent action, how often, or the timing of the belligerence, and I also looked at so if you also look at the victims of that belligerence, were those victim states similar to you in like political political regime type or foreign policy issues? So for example, if North Korea attacks Japan, obviously our foreign policies were supposed to be quite similar, but that would be a threat to us. Also, yeah, so I think those type of factors I looked into to assess the relevancy, but ultimately, how I measured belligerence was if it was belligerent, then I just coded it as 1, and if it didn't, it was 0. So it's like a dummy variable. And with dummy variables, you only get to see whether you have the presence of a belligerent ally. You can't really look at the levels of belligerence. So that's actually a very good point. If all those category factors within the relevancy category did apply, I guess that would make it a really belligerent state. But because of my amateur quantitative skills, I couldn't really generate a model that would generate a sort of like a continuous variable, like so having like an equation that would give you like 0.5 something or 0.4, so like a precise variable. So for now, I'm just sticking with dummy variables. So yeah, that is actually a very good point. And for the last question, whether belligerent states are already perceived as belligerent or it can be altered. So for this, I think to look at the concept of reputation. There's actually a lot of existing work on this, and for reputation, I think the relevancy matters, and it is subjective to some extent, but it's not like extremely subjective. Obviously, it has to be shared with different states. So, but it is to some extent subjective, and I think the main factor that you should consider here is to see whether the state had revisionist intentions. In other words, was it satisfied with the status quo of its political? Was it satisfied with the status quo? And this can obviously change depending on certain developments in international politics. So you have states like Iran. Maybe back in 1800s it wasn't. Actually, yeah, it pretty was unsatisfied with its geopolitical standing. But yeah, so basically just focusing on the revisionist intentions. And yeah, this could really just change, I think, based on the political leadership of the state. So if it is satisfied with its political standing, obviously North Korea is not, Russia certainly isn't right now, and China and Iran they're all very revisionist. They have revisionist agendas. So, but in the future, if the power dynamic shifts, then it could change, and you could sort of view these states as being more with less belligerent. Obviously, the European states back in the 1800s, they were viewed as very belligerent because they wanted to change the world in their making. But nowadays, they're a lot more viewed as peaceful. So I think that concludes it. I took such a long time, but thank you for.
I mean, definitely the relationship between North and South Korea runs hot and cold. So when they're on good terms, then there's all sorts of niceties, and when they're on bad terms, I can't remember what Kim Yo-jong said in the newspaper the other day, but she doesn't like President Yoon Suk-yeol very much. So she's been quoted as insulting him multiple times in the newspaper. Last time was in August, and I read a story yesterday about how she went on a rant about him. So it's unsurprising that they would change their nickname or terms of endearment for South Korea depending on how they're feeling about them at a given time.
On that, because I think it's really interesting, and also again in terms of politicizing naming, because that is the North Korean government choosing to delegitimize South Korea if that's if that's the name that it's using at the time or something. But if you talk to the North Korean people on a person people to people basis, they would never use the terms like any delegitimizing terms or politicized terms in their eyes that goes against South Korea, whereas the government may do that in different political climates and stuff. So I think it's a really interesting insight, and also can back up the claim that names are very politicized, and is definitely another area that I could go into in terms of research as well. Thanks for bringing it up.
All right, in that case, I would just like to thank our presenters for joining us today and sharing their research. I enjoyed it very much. I hope everyone else did as well. Thank you. Yeah. We appreciate you attending. And with that, I will call this conference to a close. So thanks again, and hopefully we'll see you down the road at another conference.